Welcome back. It's now time to go in depth. Many of us were raised knowing that if we do something wrong, there will be physical consequences to pay. I remember when I was a child, my mother's warning was always, wait until your father comes home, and we all knew what that meant. He would send us to select a belt from his closet or a switch from the tree. And then there was school, where teachers usually didn't think twice to use a ruler. I remember there was even one teacher who had a special rope for spankings, and she was feared all around the school. No one wanted to be in her class because she was particularly brutal. But in more recent times, many have come to frown on the practice of corporal punishment, especially in schools where parents may feel they have no control over what happens to their children. And such was the case in Kensington Primary School in St. Catherine, one of Jamaica's top performing schools. The school has admitted to using corporal punishment, or the fear of lashing, to motivate children to do well. Now, naturally, there's been a lot of discussion about that this week, and on the phone we have two guests. Diahann Gordon Harrison is the children's advocate, and Patrick Smith is the Senior Secretary of School Services at the Jamaica Teachers Association. Good evening to both of you.
Good evening, Kalika.
All right, well, let's start with you, Mr. Smith. You seem to be of the generation that got a beating or two as a child. What's changed now? Why is that now considered unacceptable by most?
Well, we are aware that, well, from the 90s, the then Minister of Education, Honorable Virgil Whiteman, he did insist that, of course, that teachers move away from the use of corporal punishment. You know, until the passage of the Child Care and Prevention Act, there was really nothing to prevent the administration of that. We have a handbook for school management going back to the 1950s, which even prescribed the way in which corporal punishment may be administered, A, to boys, or B, to girls, and the meticulousness with which had to be followed. Now, as an association representing teachers, we have really advised, admonished, pleaded with our membership to, as far as possible, move away from it. A, because of the prevalence of violence in our society. And in many of our homes, there's a level of violence which is unacceptable. And schools, for the most part, tend to be the area where there's some respite from this sort of violence, depending on the homes our children come from.
Mm-hmm. Now, Mrs. Gordon Harrison, you represent the children as a children's advocate. Some people say children's rights is just a bunch of hogwash. Children can have rights when they grow up. When they're young, right. It's their parents who know best.
Yes, I know that perception is there to a large extent in some parts of society. But what I'm seeing certainly, and even listening to Mr. Smith, what I'm hearing is that there's recognition now that we need to relook at how we deal with our children. You know, we have always said, and the old cliches, that children are our future. I like to say that children are not our future. They are here now. They're our future adults, but they're also people in their own right. And I don't know if you've had the privilege of interacting with any young babies. You will realize that young babies are born to parents who care for them, love them, adore them. But babies are born with their own personalities. And it really is for us to see them as individual people who have their own personalities that God gave them and their own rights. And we are really here to guide them and mold them in a particular way, but not necessarily to enforce and basically compel them to do things our way. We're here to guide them as to how to survive in a society.
But I don't know that you necessarily beat a baby that way.
No, I'm not saying that. But if you don't beat a baby that way, let's say we don't start at baby stage, when does it become okay to start using brute force to get a child to do things your way? If it's not okay at a young baby stage, and it's not okay at age 2, and it's not okay at age 3, when does it become okay to use might as being right to compel a child to do things your way?
Mr. Gordon, Mr. Smith, sorry, is it ever okay? Does it ever become okay?
I mean, I must say that I have not been the beneficiary of our intervention. It sounds rather distant and rather low, and there's some, buzz on the line. But from what I've gotten, I think there, in our society, we have to admit, of course, parents continue to exercise the right to impose some form of corporal punishment. And in the classroom, there is the assumption of, the expression in loco parentis, that teachers operate in place of the parent. The parent entrusts the children to the care of the teacher, and the teachers might, from time to time, depending on the circumstance, administer some form of physical restraint or punishment or whatever. The jury is still out as to, whether this is good or bad. We, as I have said, we decide that, of course, it's best to stay away from it, especially because of the violent reactions that we tend to experience, where parents, members of the community, or guardians may react angrily or violently to teachers who may, impose this sort of punishment on their children.
Now, the Education Minister, Mr. Ronald Thwaites, he says the ministry is now coming up with a policy to ban corporal punishment entirely in schools. But earlier this week, he also told us that in certain situations it may be okay. Let's play back that clip.
Severe antisocial behavior, I believe that it may be permissible for principals to apply corporal punishment in moderation and in very exceptional circumstances. We're moving in the direction of banning it entirely, but I believe that we have to recognize the culture and the fact that there are people who now don't seem to understand that beating children is not the way to teach them anything except violence.
Mrs. Gordon Harrison, what do you think about that?
Well, I agree with the minister that when you use beating as the first recourse, it's really sending a subliminal message that violence is the way to get persons to conform to your views, which cannot be good. Because to my mind, if you are saying that violence is the way to get persons to agree with you, then you're sending a very, very distorted message to young people.
But he also said that in some cases, like principals should still be allowed, although they are, he's not really giving a firm position. He's saying in some cases principals should be allowed to administer corporal punishment.
Yes, I heard the minister. The greater message that I'm getting from him is where it is the ministry is moving towards, which is a complete ban against corporal punishment. And I just want to say, that I think it's important that persons don't see us as just saying, oh, don't beat children and, just love them up anyway. We're saying that children will need discipline from time to time. That has been the case from time immemorial, and children have to be guided. But what we're saying is that we need to look at perhaps more positive ways of disciplining children, one. And two, from what Mr. Smith is saying, and I totally agree with him, I think that teachers now need to start protecting themselves. Because you could have a situation where a student is from a particularly violent background, and if the teacher tries to beat that student may retaliate and start fighting the teacher.
Last question now, and an important one. What about the academic success of Kensington? Doesn't this prove that maybe corporal punishment works? It's one of the top performing schools in the island.
I agree with that. I would have to see some scientific proof that there is a direct link in terms of the methods that they use and the grades that they're getting. The children could be performing for a number of different reasons.
Mr. Smith, your take on that?
To the conclusion.
Well, I believe that there are many ingredients in the making of a successful school. The principal, the school administration, the board the minister, has given them in law the right to institute such rules for the good running of the institution. Now, I think that we tend to react this knee-jerk effect. Now, if that parent did not publicly come out and rule against the matter, then we would have gone our merry way to think that all is well at Kensington, and maybe all is well at Kensington.
So
the
true.
fact that a parent determined that, of course, that is not the way to go.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time, but thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Smith, the
You're very
Senior
welcome.
Secretary of School Services at the Jamaica Teachers Association, and also Mrs. Diahann Gordon Harrison. She's the Children's Advocate. A hearty
Thank you for having
discussion.
me.
Yes, thanks for joining us. A hearty discussion there on corporal punishment. Well, speaking of beatings, find out who got a whooping in sports when we come back.